It was raining that morning, just lightly, one of those thin silver rains that doesn't soak your coat but leaves a mist on your lashes. I remember noticing the way it curled on the church steps, collecting in the small dip near the third one. The same one Aaron used to skip over when we came here for weddings, for baptisms, for other people's endings. I was late by 5 minutes. Not enough to make a scene, but enough for every head to already be turned forward, for the music to have already started. The organ wheezed a little, the way old instruments do when they've been left waiting too long. I paused just inside. The arched doorway, breathing in the scent of candle wax, lilies, and faint mildew. My hands were damp. Not from the rain. There were no ushers, no soft-spoken helpers gesturing me forward. Just a tight row of bodies, pew after pew, shoulder to shoulder. Faces I recognized, most of them some from Christmas dinners, some from photos in Aaron's family albums. Ruth sat in the second row, spine straight, her lipstick too bright for morning. Esther, beside her, wore a dark veil that didn't hide the sharp tilt of her chin as she turned to whisper something. A small, deliberate glance backward. Right past me, no seat. Not one. I stayed where I was, at the edge of the aisle, my heels sinking slightly into the carpet. There was a strange heat in my throat, thin and rising, like the flicker of a match. Before it catches, I scanned again, more carefully this time, as if perhaps I'd missed something. A gap. A kind face waving me over. But no one moved. There was a space next to Aaron's cousin. I think her name might have been Margot Butt. As I stepped forward, she shifted her bag onto the seat beside her. Neatly, wordlessly. I didn't sit. I stood. The priest had begun his opening words. I didn't hear them. My ears had begun to hum, not from anger, not even from sadness, but from the deep recognition of something I had, until then, kept wrapped in the folds of my denial. I wasn't. Part of them, not really. Aaron had always said family was complicated. He'd say it with a gentle smile, the kind that suggested we should all be patient, kind, forgiving. But standing there, surrounded by backs that didn't turn, by silence that didn't make room, I realized just how easy it is to exclude someone without ever saying a word. The light from the stained glass caught in the veil of incense. A crimson glow bled across the white casket at the front. For a moment, it looked like it was burning. Esther dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Ruth looked down at the folded program in her lap, her mouth set. There was a photo of Aaron on the front one. I hadn't chosen. That was the part that struck me hardest, I think. Not the lack of a seat, not even the blank stares. It was that photo. A smiling, handsome version of Aaron from some family reunion I hadn't been invited to. They had already rewritten him. And in doing so, rewritten me out. I stayed there the entire service. People came in behind me and stood, but none of them were family. A man in a beige trench coat stood beside me and offered a small nod. A neighbor, maybe. He didn't ask why I was standing. I clasped my hands in front of me and looked straight ahead. My wedding ring felt loose on my finger. It had started slipping off since Aaron's illness grief does strange things to the body. When they carried the casket out, Ruth brushed past me. Her perfume was sharp, medicinal. She didn't look at me. Esther followed, arm-linked with a man I didn't know. I didn't follow them to the burial. I waited until the church was empty, until the candles burned low. Then I sat in the very last pew alone, and exhaled the breath I'd been holding since I stepped in. Some part of me broke in that moment, not like glass. Not loud or sharp, but like the slow crack of ice beneath warm water. Quiet, invisible. Final. I remember the courtyard more clearly than the ceremony itself. It was small, stone-floored, wrapped in weathered terracotta and filled with potted herbs that always leaned toward the light. In the late afternoons, just after we moved into Aaron's family house, the sun would fall across the flagstones in long, slanted ribbons, softening everything it touched. That's where we spent our earliest days with a chipped porcelain teapot in one hand, me with a sprig of basil and a tiny bowl of oil in the other. We didn't speak much in those hours. There wasn't a need to dot. Aaron was gentle in those days, with a kind of quiet that didn't demand anything. He'd hum sometimes while pouring the tea, always the same low melody, half remembered from his childhood. I asked him once what it was, and he said he wasn't sure. Just something his mother used to hum. He said it like it was a fond memory, but his eyes had drifted as he spoke. "'Kay?" And I wasn't entirely convinced. There was a sweetness to the way he touched things. His fingertips brushed the rim of the teacups as though they were breakable, and maybe that's what made me believe back then that love could be soft and sufficient. That his gentleness would be enough to balance out everything. I didn't understand yet about his family. I'd met Ruth before we married. She wore a forest green dress to our engagement party, the kind that clung just enough to make it clear she didn't mind the attention. She gave me a smile that was almost convincing, all teeth and polish, and said something about how nice it was to finally meet Aaron's mystery girl. She laughed after that, and I tried to laugh too, but it stuck in my throat. She hugged me tightly that night, too tightly, and when she pulled back, she brushed a strand of my hair behind my ear like we were old friends. I remember thinking it was sweet at first. Later, I recognized it for what it was, a performance. Ruth was always performing. Esther was quieter. She wore navy blue and smelled like lavender sachets and starch. She kissed both my cheeks with lips that felt too dry and told me Aaron had always liked smart women. I thanked her, unsure whether it was a compliment or a caution. There was something behind her eyes I couldn't quite read, like she was cataloging me. Her gaze swept from my dress to my shoes, and she held her smile just a second too long. They didn't say anything unkind, not once. That was the thing. No harsh words, no accusations. Just that strange, echoing warmth, the kind that never quite touches the skin. I chalked it up to nerves, to being new. But there was a moment I still think about. The night before our wedding, Aaron and I sat in the courtyard. Lanterns swinging gently above us, the air thick with the smell of rosemary and warm stone. I was nervous of the vows of the family, of the weight of everything about to change. He reached over and took my hand, lacing his fingers through mine like it was the most natural thing in the world. He said, softly, that everything would be fine, that they would come around, that love could make space where there wasn't any before. I wanted to believe him, and for a while, I did. In that courtyard, with his hand in mine and the evening pressed close around us, I let myself imagine that belonging was something I could earn. That kindness, even the hollow kind, was a door I could eventually open. I didn't know then that some doors were never meant to open. Some are there just to remind you that you're standing outside. It didn't happen all at once, not with a shout or a slammed door. It's just small things, like a chair nudged ever so slightly out of place. That's how it started, just enough to. Notice, not enough to name. The first was the place card. Esther's birthday dinner, long table dressed in ivory linen, candles flickering low and delicate in glass holders. I remember admiring the way the silverware caught the light, the sound of Ruth's laughter carrying easily across the room. Each name printed in fine script, folded 10 style, neat and deliberate. I wandered along the edge, fingers tracing each one until the end, where I found none for me. There were 12 seats, 11 names. Esther said it was a printing oversight, smiled thinly and patted my shoulder, told me to sit wherever. But everyone already had their places, their names, their stories pressed neatly into place. I slid into the last empty seat between two people I barely knew. My chair was half an inch farther from the table than the others, and I felt it. Later, I told Aaron, hoping for something small recognition. Maybe even an apology, not from them, but for the fact that it had hurt. He rubbed the back of his neck and said, "Esther isn't detail-oriented." Then he kissed the top of my head and asked if I wanted more wine. I said no. But I meant yes, for something else entirely. Then there was the teacup. It was a Sunday brunch. Ruth had invited us, made sure to emphasize how casual it would be. We arrived with a small tart I'd baked, wrapped in a linen towel. The table was set for 6 mismatched plates, jam jars, a butter dish shaped like a cow, charming in its way. She handed me a teacup, delicate china, pale pink, with a rim chipped just enough to feel sharp if your lip brushed it wrong. She noticed I saw it in the way her eyes dropped to the edge, then quickly back up to my face. A flicker, nothing more. I held it anyway. Didn't drink. Just smiled. When Aaron and I were leaving, I mentioned it in passing. How odd it was, that cup. He chuckled, told me I was reading into things. Ruth has always used the old set, said I. Was being sensitive. And maybe I was. Maybe that's how it works. The slow erosion of certainty. Not through blows, but by quiet disqualifications. It wasn't just those moments. It was how Ruth always greeted me a second too late when others were present, her eyes flitting past as though recalibrating my importance. Or the way Esther called. Aaron, my sweet boy in front of me, her voice syrupy and thick, like he was still hers. Untouched. Aaron never challenged it. Not once. At first, I brought these things to him gently, carefully, like someone cradling something cracked, but not yet broken. He'd listen with one ear, fingers scrolling his phone or checking the time. And he'd say things like, "It's just how they are," or "They don't mean anything by it." What he didn't say was how it made him feel when I said it made me feel. Less. Eventually, I stopped bringing them up. It was easier that way, easier than watching him shift, trying to stay neutral. As if taking a side would pull the rug out from under everything, and so my silences started stacking. One on top of the other, a quiet tower built from things I didn't say. It's strange how silence can feel heavier than sound. How not speaking becomes its own kind of ache. By the time the next dinner came around, I no longer expected a place. I brought my own teacup once, tucked inside my bag, and then didn't use it. Just knowing it was there made the room feel slightly less sharp. Aaron held my hand under the table that night. His thumb brushed mine absent-mindedly. I looked at him, but he didn't look back. That was the moment I realized he didn't notice. I'd gone quiet. Or maybe he did and preferred it. It didn't happen overnight. That's the cruel thing about slow illnesses. They don't announce themselves like accidents do. They seep in. Quiet, unwelcome, like water through a crack in the ceiling. Aaron had been tired for weeks. At first, we blamed the long hours, the stress, the way he never quite gave himself a full rest. But then the fatigue stayed, thickened, changed its shape. His hands began to tremble when he poured tea. His sentences shortened. His breath, on some mornings, came in shallow pulls. As though air had become reluctant. I remember the first time he collapsed. In the hallway between the kitchen and the door. It was early, not even 7, and the birds hadn't yet settled into their usual chorus. He didn't fall hard. It was more like he folded, just lowered himself to the floor, hand against the wall, face turned away from me. He didn't speak for a long time. We drove to the hospital in silence. He hated fuss, always had. But that silence, it wasn't stoic. It was something more complicated, like he was already bracing for what was to come. The tests began. One after another, names I couldn't pronounce. Scans in cold rooms with harsh lights. I sat beside him, clutching a clipboard with too many boxes to check. It felt like we had wandered into a foreign country without knowing the language. And somewhere in the fog of it all, Ruth and Esther arrived. At first it was small things. A text from Ruth to the doctor when Aaron was asleep. Esther offering to handle the insurance forms while I went to get coffee. They spoke with gentle smiles and reassuring words, all laced with something else. Something that sounded like care, but felt like control. Then the phone call started. I'd walk into the hospital room and hear Esther on the line updating a cousin I hadn't met, her voice soft and practiced. Ruth had made a group chat, one I wasn't added to. Aaron's siblings, old family friends, distant aunts, they all knew more than I did, knew before I did. The strangest part was the way Aaron didn't see it. Or maybe he chose not to. When I finally brought it up quietly, not in anger, just in confusion, he looked at me like I'd accused them of something unspeakable. He said they were just trying to help, that it wasn't about me, but it was. It always had been. It wasn't about power. Not exactly, it was about presence, about being seen. I was there every hour. I held his water when his hands shook, read to him from his favorite book when he couldn't sleep. I sat beside him in the evenings when the air turned still and heavy. But when updates were sent, when plans were made, my name was absent. I started keeping a notebook, not for the doctors or the symptoms, but for the silences. The moments where I vanished in their conversations, the time Ruth answered Aaron's. Phone and told the person on the other end she'd pass it along. Like I wasn't sitting right there, Aaron grew thinner, quieter. His strength faded like morning fog. His hands stopped reaching for mine as often, not because he didn't want to, but because everything began to cost him something, even small gestures. One day I arrived at the hospital and found the room rearranged. No choristers, I was told, had been brought in, sat closer to his bedside than mine. She had brought a blanket from their childhood home and laid it across his lap. Ruth had printed photos of their family vacations and taped them to the wall. No one had. As Dot, I remember sitting in the corner, watching them smile, fuss, touch his hand. I watched Aaron look at them with that old familiar expression, the one that said he didn't want to upset anyone. It's always been that way. It's gentle to a fault. When we were alone, I asked him if it ever felt like I was being edged out. He closed his eyes and said nothing for a long time. Then, finally, he whispered, "They just want to help." I nodded, even though it wasn't an answer. That night, I turned my phone to silent. It hadn't rung all day anyway. It was late past midnight, maybe. The house had taken on that particular stillness that only arrives after someone's been sick inside it. Even the air felt hesitant, like it didn't want to press too hard against the walls. Aaron was resting upstairs, finally asleep after another long day of shuffling pills across. The table and pretending food had flavor, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts kept returning to the way his voice had sounded earlier. Thinner than usual, as though whatever was inside him had begun reaching up through his throat. So I went downstairs, barefoot, tracing the path I used to walk when things felt more certain. I don't know what pulled me into his study. I hadn't spent much time in there since his illness worsened. It always smelled faintly of old paper and cedar. He liked the window cracked, even in winter. Books leaned into each other on the shelves like old friends. His desk was the same as ever, scattered with notes, curled photographs, receipts folded into quiet triangles. NDD. The drawer. The bottom right one. I hadn't noticed it before, not really, but something about the way it sat slightly ajar, just enough to tease, made me reach down and try it. It didn't open. I tugged again, gently at first, then firmer. Nothing. The metal inside clicked. Faintly, a soft rattle, like something inside had shifted with the movement. It wasn't empty. That much was certain. I sat back on my heels, heart oddly steady, not racing, but aware. Like it had stepped closer to something and didn't yet know whether to lean in or back away. The next morning, I asked him. We were in the kitchen, sun struggling through the blinds. Was stirring tea but not drinking it, a habit he'd picked up somewhere along the line. I asked lightly about the drawer, said I noticed it wouldn't open. His hands paused just slightly before resuming their movement. He didn't look up, said something vague, just papers, nothing important. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that ends before it begins, and changed the subject. But his eyes, it didn't meet mine. Later that day, when he was napping, I returned to the study. Not with urgency, but a quiet curiosity. The drawer was gone. Not locked, not jammed, gone. The entire bottom panel of the desk had been removed. cleanly, surgically, as though it had never been there. No dust ring, no scrape, just a blank space where a drawer had once lived. I stood there for a long time, not sure. What unsettled me more the fact that he had removed it, or the ease with which it had disappeared. I didn't mention it again, not to him, not to anyone, but something shifted in me after that. There had always been distance, of course, between me and Ruth, me and Esther. Even between me and the versions of Aaron they insisted existed. But now there was a new space, one between me and Aaron himself. A space that couldn't be filled with tea or silence or soft apologies. I began to watch him differently. Not with suspicion, exactly, but with a kind of quiet alertness one reserves for a door that might not be locked after all. I listened more closely to what he didn't say, and in that absence the drawer stayed open, not physically, but in me. An empty shape waiting to be named. It was the sound of the doorbell that unsettled me first. Not the usual chime we were used to, but a flat, practical tone, brief and indifferent. I wiped my hands on a kitchen towel, half expecting a delivery, or a nurse come early, but instead, a man in a navy overcoat stood on the porch, thin briefcase tucked beneath his arm like something ceremonial. He asked for Aaron, said he was a notary. I didn't know what for. There had been no discussion, no warning, just that clipped visit and the way Aaron from the living room had nodded before I could ask anything at all. He said he'd sign quickly, that it wasn't a big deal, but I stood there unmoving as the man unpacked his pen and papers on the coffee table, papers with our address on them, our names in neat serif type. I could see the word estate in bold. I saw Ruth's name, then Esther's, not mine, not at the top, not where I expected to be. I didn't interrupt. I watched him sign with the same gentle hand that used to pour tea. His signature still steady, even as the rest of him had thinned and faded. I waited until the door closed and the quiet returned. And then I asked him simply what the papers were. He didn't lie. He said they were updates. Said he wanted things to be smooth. That he'd asked Ruth to help because, he added, she knew. The right words for these kinds of things. I asked why I hadn't been told. His eyes, when they met mine, were tired. Not defensive, just weary. Like I was another demand he wasn't sure he could meet. He didn't answer right away. Just leaned back against the couch cushions and rubbed his forehead. Then he said softly, I just want peace. Peace. That word lodged itself somewhere deep. Not because I didn't understand it, but because of what it implied. That my voice, my presence, my questions were disruptions. I stood in the kitchen later that night, staring at the stove without seeing it, hands resting on the edge of the counter. The papers sat folded in my mind, and I replayed each small moment that had led here. Every silence, every decision made with me just slightly out of frame. They'd drawn the outlines of the future without me. Ruth, with her precision and practiced ease. Esther, with her steady, matriarchal calm. Together, they'd shaped what would remain names and numbers and instructions. All wrapped in the language of care, and Aaron had let them. He hadn't meant it to hurt, I know that. That was never his way. But avoidance, when layered thick. Enough becomes its own kind of betrayal. It wasn't about the money or the titles. It was about the door that had quietly closed somewhere. Along the hallway of our marriage, the one that led to shared decisions. 2 whispered debates in the dark. Now there were only signatures. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the thin blue ring his tea mug had left on the wood earlier. It was still wet, still present, and yet already fading. That's how it felt. Like I was watching everything dissolve before me. Still warm to the touch, but disappearing just the same. I didn't cry, not then. I made myself a cup of tea, sat still. Okay. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't ask him if he needed anything, because I already knew he wanted peace, and he'd chosen who would give it to him. It was raining the day Aaron died. A quiet, steady kind of rain that tapped the windows like an old memory persistent, but without urgency. The house felt smaller that morning, like the walls had leaned in during the night and stayed there. I sat beside his bed, holding a hand. That had grown to light, as if the weight of flesh had already begun to slip away. He spoke just once. His voice was thin, barely there, a thread of breath woven between syllables. I couldn't catch all of it, but what I heard was sorry, not drawn out. Just that single word exhaled more than spoken, like it had been sitting behind his ribs for too long and found its way out too late. I didn't answer, not with words, just kept my fingers closed gently around his, even as they slackened. After that, the silence came quickly. The kind that doesn't ask for permission. Things moved fast, in the way death has of making people efficient. Ruth handled the call to the funeral home. Esther contacted the church. I wasn't asked about any of it. There were no late-night discussions over coffee, no hushed planning around the kitchen table, only forms passed between hands. I wasn't. Part of the program arrived in our mailbox 2 days later, a thick ivory fold printed in gold ink. I turned it over twice before I noticed Etruth's name listed as the point of contact. Not mine, not even a shared mention. It's just her. I sat on the porch with the program in my lap, rain misting just beyond the overhang. A bee drifted by, slow and uninterested. The paper felt too smooth in my hands. By the time the day came, I already knew what to expect. I'd rehearsed it quietly in my mind, where I would stand, what I would wear, the face I would keep. The church was full. A packed hush settled over the pews as I stepped inside. Familiar faces turned, softened, then looked away. There were flowers on every ledge lease. Mostly, the kind Aaron used to say, reminded him of his grandmother's house. And then there was the front row Ruth in black. Her chin slightly lifted. Esther beside her, eyes dry, hands folded neatly over a velvet clutch. Aunts and cousins flanking them like guards. No gap, no space, no seat. I stood in the aisle, not for drama, just because there was nowhere else. Someone behind me offered a polite smile, the kind strangers give at weddings and funerals when they know they aren't part of the inner circle. I nodded back, keeping still. The service began. A hymn I didn't know, followed by a reading from someone Ruth introduced as Aaron's oldest friend, though I'd never heard his name. Each speaker wore the same practiced reverence carefully. Stitching together a version of Aaron, I recognized in pieces his wit, his work, his laugh, but always just slightly askew. As though the years we spent together had been tucked away in the margins. No one mentioned our courtyard or the tea, or the way he'd hum when he thought no one could hear. I stood and listened. Unmoved. When they carried the casket down the aisle, Ruth touched it first. Esther followed, pressing her hand against the polished wood like a blessing. I stayed where I was. No one turned to include me. I watched them walk past this procession of mourners who had rewritten him in their image. Outside, the rain had eased to a thin drizzle. The ground was soft beneath my shoes, and the sky hung low, as if the whole world had slouched into itself. I didn't go to the burial. I walked instead, around the block. Past the bakery he used to visit for Sunday rolls. Past the bench where he once waited for me in the cold, holding a folded paper bag with my name written in shaky pen. By the time I got home, the house was quiet. The chair where he used to sit was still angled toward the window, a tea ring on. The table, half faded. I left the program unopened on the counter. Later that evening, I made myself a single cup of tea. No sugar, no lemon. Just hot water and leaves, and for the first time since the rain started, I sat down, alone in the kitchen, and let the silence settle in beside me. Not grief, it's not rage, just the kind of stillness that comes when you've finally been written out of someone's story. And no, you'll never be asked to read it again. The house was colder than I remembered. Not from the weather, but from the absence that had finally rooted itself in the walls. Everything felt paused coats, still on their hooks, shoes lined by the door, as if waiting for a return that would never come. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't speak his name aloud. I walked through the silence like someone retracing the outline of a life, touching nothing. The envelope was still where I'd left it, top drawer of the sideboard under old bank statements and expired coupons. Unmarked, unsealed, but I recognized the shape of it instantly. It wasn't the final version that one had gone to Ruth, Esther, the lawyers, the clean hands. This was a draft. Aaron's handwriting on the margins, crossed out words, few lines rewritten twice. My name was there, not prominently, not excessively, but carefully, with consideration. The way someone who's afraid of hurting people writes when he wants to do the right thing, but softly. I'd read it once, weeks ago, before the notary ever arrived. I'd read it and said nothing. Back then, I thought silence might preserve the promise inside it. Now, reading it again, the ink looked faded. He never filed it. There was no mistake in that. I held the paper over the sink at first, then changed my mind. Took it to the fireplace instead. It felt more honest that way. I lit it with a match from the drawer, the kind we used to keep for storms. The edges curled inward, slow at first, then faster as the flames found their rhythm. I didn't cry. I watched the fire eat through every line my name, his words, the parts that might have mattered. Watched the paper bend and crumple like something relieved to be released when it was gone. I swept the ashes into a small dish and left it on the WINDOWSILL. Then I poured myself a glass of water, sat down at the kitchen table, took out a fresh sheet of paper, not to write to him, not to speak to the past, but to begin something that would not ask for forgiveness or permission. I began with the words to whom it will concern. I didn't dress it in sentiment. I didn't soften it with memory. I listed what mattered, what would remain. I named no one who hadn't made space for me, the names that had filled the front row of the funeral Esther. Ruth, the cousins who never looked me in the eye, they were absent. I didn't leave room for them, not out of anger, not even out of hurt, just absence. Sometimes the most final thing you can give someone is nothing. My handwriting was steady, sharper than I expected, as though my body had been waiting for the chance to say what my voice never could. I folded the paper in thirds, tucked it into an envelope, wrote the date in the corner. Outside, the rain had slowed to a hush, misting the window pane in soft threads. I leaned my head against the glass for a moment, let the chill settle into my skin. The house didn't feel warmer, but it felt cleaner. There were no raised voices, no corrections. Just the sound of pages turning in a room where I was finally the one holding the pen. And in that stillness, I didn't feel erased. I felt certain. The house looks different now. Not larger, not cleaner, just quieter. Like it finally settled into itself. A year has passed, though it doesn't announce itself with anything loud. No anniversaries marked in red, no notes circled on calendars. It's just a slow shift in the way light moves through the rooms, slow return to breathing without bracing. I hosted something today, small, unceremonious. A few of Aaron's friends, Camriel friends. The ones who showed up not with casseroles or condolences, but with memory. David brought the record player Aaron used to fuss over. Elaine, the neighbor from 2 doors down, arrived with lemon bars and a quiet smile. She didn't ask what the occasion was, she just came. There was no program, no schedule. I served tea in the chipped cups I used to hide from Ruth, the ones I liked. We sat on the back porch. A breeze moved softly through the herbs I replanted last spring. Basil, lavender, a stubborn bit of thyme. Someone told a story about Aaron in college, the kind of tale that holds no moral but makes you feel like you knew him better afterward. Laughter came easily. No one tried to turn it solemn. There was a photograph of him on the table. Faded a little now, taken during one of our quiet afternoons in the courtyard, sunlight caught just so on his shoulder. No one moved it, no one pointed to it. It was simply there, like a chair no longer occupied but not forgotten. Ruth wasn't invited, neither was Esther. It wasn't about revenge. I didn't feel the need to hurt them. Just didn't feel the need to explain anymore. Some erasures don't come from spite. They come from stillness, the quiet kind that settles over you. When the world stops insisting that you fight for space you were never meant to occupy. I lit a candle beside the photo once everyone had gone. Not a ritual. It's just something instinctive. The flame flickered slightly in the breeze, catching the edge of the frame in a soft golden wash. I watched it, not thinking about anything in particular. I didn't cry. There's a strange peace in knowing you don't need to be seen to know. You existed. I had loved Aaron. That remained. But I no longer held myself hostage to what others thought that love should have looked like. The will I wrote sits in a drawer now. Not the drawer Aaron had removed, but one I chose myself, Oak. Shallow, nothing. Hidden inside is a single page. It's short, not filled with instructions or airs. Just a few lines about where things should go, and one sentence for them. To those who had no seat for me, I leave no room in return. Nothing harsh. It's just clarity. Sometimes the most dignified goodbye is the one never spoken aloud. I blew out. The candle before the wax dipped too low. The smoke curled gently, vanishing before it reached the ceiling. The house remained quiet. My name was mine again, not Ruth's version. Not Esther's afterthought. Just mine, and for the first time. In a long time, that felt like enough.